Natural Habitat Adventures is pleased to be bringing you this webinar today. We're here to talk about the legendary wolves of Yellowstone. We're broadcasting live today from Jackson, Wyoming. We're here with Kevin Taylor. And I'd like to tell you a little bit more about Kevin before I turn it over to him. Kevin has a bachelor's degree in biology from Bradley University in Peoria, Illinois, and gained a master's degree in botany from the University of Wyoming in Laramie. Kevin's experiences have ranged from working as a contract biologist with the Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Park Service in Helena, Montana, to teaching summer courses with the Rocky Mountain Biological Laboratory in Colorado. Kevin has had a passion for the wolves of the Yellowstone region for years, and on our trips conveys that passion to each and every traveler. He brings to Natural Habitat Adventures experience in plant taxonomy, natural history knowledge, and a teaching background, educating people about the biodiversity, wonders, and value of conservation in the natural world. So we're really lucky to be with Kevin today, and I, for one, am excited to hear more about these fabulous wolves in Yellowstone. So, Kevin, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Lee, and thank you all participants for joining me today. I think I heard clapping and cheering in the background, but I'm not sure. But it's great to be with all of you. Before we continue on, I do have some credit to give here. I'm fortunate to know some pretty excellent photographers who have provided me with images that I'll share with you today. And all the images actually were taken either on trips or while photographers are out in Grand Teton and Yellowstone National Parks. Those people, of course, are Colin McNulty, Eric Rock, Paul Brown, Sean Beckett, Jared Becker, Jay Goodrich, Jonathan Spear, Henry Holdsworth, and the National Park Service. Okay, so there's a picture of me. That way you don't have to use your imagination quite so much. You can see a picture of me there. I live in Jackson Hole with my wife and 9-year-old daughter, and hopefully this will be apparent to you over the course of the next hour, but I'm very passionate about the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. There's no place I'd rather live. And if my daughter doesn't become a naturalist, it won't be due to lack of exposure. With this talk, I plan to talk about the ecology, geology, and human history of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, and then I'll be including some details of exploring this place with Natural Habitat Adventures. Okay, so first, let's talk about this area of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, just so you understand what we're talking about. All that green space that you see there, that borders Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho, this is all considered to be the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Depending on how you define it, it's made up of approximately 18 million acres. It's one of the largest intact ecosystems in the temperate latitudes around the world. So it's a very special place. And of course, it's located in 3 different states. And it's funny how the animals nor the plant seeds seem to pay any attention to those political boundaries. This greater Yellowstone ecosystem is made up of 2 national parks, Yellowstone, which is the square there, Yellowstone National Park, which is about 2.2 million acres. And then, of course, below south of Yellowstone is Grand Teton National Park. That's about 310,000 acres. And then the surrounding 3 wildlife refuges, 7 national parks, Bureau of Land Management lands, state lands, and private lands make up all of about 18 million acres. So we're talking about a very large area and a very intact area. One of the incredible things about this place, and I think one of the top 5 reasons I live here, is that all the animal species that were here prior to settlement are still here, and that's pretty unique for the lower 48 states. So let's enter Yellowstone. The north entrance of Yellowstone National Parks has this arch. It's called the Roosevelt Arch. It's in the north end of Yellowstone National Park, and the cornerstone for this arch was actually laid in 1903 by Teddy Roosevelt. However, if you remember U.S. history, it was actually Ulysses S. Grant who was the president in 1872 when Yellowstone became the first national park. And I'll repeat that again. In 1872, Yellowstone was the world's first national park. Now, of course, I oftentimes think of Yellowstone as being 2.2 million acres of wonderful wildlife habitat. I'm a little wildlife biased that way. However, Yellowstone was really set aside in 1872, not necessarily for its wildlife habitat, although certainly that did result, as a default, but it was really set aside because of the geothermal features. 3/4, and feel free to ooh and ah in the background here, because 3/4 of the world's geothermal features, and when I say geothermal features, I'm talking about geysers, hot springs, mud pots, and steam vents, but 3/4 of the world's geothermal features are located within the boundaries of Yellowstone National Park. Said another way, 75% of the world's geothermal features occur in Yellowstone. That's pretty amazing. This is actually Old Faithful geyser, which is a geyser that extends, that shoots up water, boiling water essentially, about 140 feet into the air, and it goes off every 90 minutes plus or minus 10. There are other bigger geysers in Yellowstone, but there's not a geyser that comes anywhere close to Old Faithful as far as its predictiveness. There's an area called Mammoth Hot Springs up in northern Yellowstone National Park that is basically calcium carbonate that comes out of the ground and layers itself in these layers. Just for scale, each one of these shelves is about 5 or 6 feet high. So pretty interesting feature. In the wintertime, Yellowstone is just such a beautifully harsh and wild place. I always feel like, even in the city, when it's cold and it's snowy, there's just a whole new layer of wildness that's added to a place, and that's one of the things I love about wintertime. So oftentimes people ask me about precipitation, how much precipitation occurs in Yellowstone and the surrounding area. And typically when we talk about precipitation here, we're talking about snow. Really, most of the precipitation that falls as snow. We do get some spring rains and spring falls, but most important as far as moisture is snow. I oftentimes like to tell folks that you can at least be partially correct if you answer just about any ecological question, if you answer it in the following way. Get your pens and paper ready. If you say long cold winters with deep snow and short cool dry summers, you can be at least partially right to most ecological questions. So you'll have to remember that. That's definitely a common theme here. So on our natural habitat trips in the wintertime in Yellowstone, we stay in lodging in or around the park. And one of the areas we stay is right at the Old Faithful area. This is the Old Faithful Inn. The Old Faithful Inn is a beautiful building architecturally. It's a very impressive building. But one of the reasons, well, we don't stay in the inn itself because it was never built to be used in the wintertime. In the inside of this lobby, it has a huge ceiling and huge architectural pizzazz that would be very difficult to heat in the wintertime. So we actually stay in a lodge right behind it. But as you can see, it's a very interesting building. It's not unusual for us in the wintertime to be able to watch Old Faithful erupt with maybe only a couple other dozen people in the area, which is pretty incredible. And sometimes after dark by moonlight, sometimes we're the only ones out there watching Old Faithful. Winter in Yellowstone is very intimate. I don't know how well you can see this, but if you look closely, especially at the bottom of the screen, you can see some tracks. Those are wolf tracks. And the reason I put them up there is that so oftentimes people who have been in wolf country perhaps have seen tracks or have heard wolves howl, but haven't necessarily seen the wolves themselves. What I've realized over the years, and I've been leading wolf programs in Yellowstone National Park for over 13 years now, and what I realized after interacting with people from the United States and then countries throughout the world, what I've realized is that the Lamar Valley of northern Yellowstone may be the most likely place, not only in North America, but perhaps the most likely place in the world to see wild wolves. The wolves were reintroduced into Yellowstone in 1995 and 1996. So pretty exciting. Last January was the 20th anniversary. And Yellowstone has outstanding wolf habitat. And so what does wolf habitat made up of, you might ask? Well, there's three big things. One is a lot of space. Number two is a lot of food. And then finally, the third one is human tolerance. And wolves oftentimes are typically pack animals. And there's three, I would say, main reasons why they're pack animals. One is that they're just social animals, kind of like people. They also tend to like to hunt together, especially hunting large animals. It helps to have multiple animals hunting. And then finally, and this is one of the ones that's maybe not quite intuitive, is it's important for wolves to have babysitters. Like, for example, right now, wolf pups are at these rendezvous site areas where they spend the day, and it's usually right in the heart of their territory. Most of the pack is off hunting, while there's always a 1-year-old or maybe a 2-year-old or perhaps a 1 and a 2-year-old wolf back at the rendezvous site babysitting the pups while the rest of the wolves are off hunting. And so this is a very important role and a very important aspect of wolves being very social and in packs. Sometimes, of course, we see lone wolves. And one of the ways that lone wolves and other wolves in general communicate over long distances are by howling. It's not unusual for wolves to have 100, 200, 300 square mile territories, and so howling is a great way to be able to communicate across those areas. Winter, particularly January and February, and even early March, is probably the most likely time to hear a wolf howl. And boy, if you talk about wild sounds, I've heard a lot of wild sounds over the years, and I don't know if there's one more wild, at least in my opinion, than a wolf howl. It's different than a coyote howl. Many of you have heard coyotes howl. It's kind of a high-pitched, kind of a wolf howl is much lower, and once you hear it, you'll never mistake it for a coyote howl. It's more of a lower pitch. It sounds like this. You can hear it's a much lower frequency. There's a lot of variation in wolf coat color. They can range anywhere from black to gray and everything in between. And in Yellowstone, there's even a couple of white wolves. White wolf coloration is actually pretty unusual in the ecosystem. A lot more wolves up in the Arctic, up in Alaska, and northern Canada are white, but they do range in color. As you can imagine, a wolf on snow definitely sticks out a lot better, especially a gray-colored one versus in the vegetation. Sometimes if there's not snow and a gray wolf is moving through the gray sagebrush shrubs in the background there, they can be hard to see. But there's I would say, three main reasons why watching wolves and other wildlife in the snow is particularly great versus other times of the season. One is they just stand out so much better on the snow, especially the black wolves. The other reason is there's no such thing as the heat of the day. So even though we oftentimes get up early and stay out late watching animals, it's not unusual to see wolves and other wildlife right in the middle of the day because it's cold all day. And then finally, leaves of a lot of the trees and shrubs will fall off in the fall. Therefore, animals like moose, for example, can't hide in a bush quite so readily. Okay, and so even though wolves is certainly a common theme of this talk, you can't help but talk about other animals and how they're connected, because it sounds cliche sometimes that all things are connected in this ecosystem, but truly things are. And the more I study and observe and teach about this ecosystem, the more I realize that's the case. So a staple food for wolves is elk. 90% on average. It depends, it varies, over the course of the year, but on average, 90% of what wolves eat are elk. Elk are the most abundant mammal in Yellowstone and Grand Teton National Parks. Those antlers, which they put a tremendous amount of energy into, fall off every year, which is pretty amazing. And so oftentimes, we think of populations of animals based so heavily upon the predators managing the prey herd, but sometimes it can be just as much the reverse. And so how many elk are in an area can oftentimes dictate how many wolves are in an area as well, or how many wolf packs. So when we're looking for wolves, we're oftentimes looking for clues as to where the wolves might be, because in the scheme of things, wolves can be over huge territories. So what we oftentimes do is we look at the behavior of other animals. If you are in wolf country and you see this scene right here with these elk all gathered in a tight group, most of which are looking in one direction, that usually indicates that there's a predator, oftentimes a wolf, in the area. Another potential prey or food source for wolves is bison, sometimes called buffalo. On average, about 5% of what wolves eat in the ecosystem is bison. They've got that huge, look at that size of that head. Sometimes on a bull bison, just the head alone can weigh up to 200 pounds, which is pretty incredible. And that huge hump of theirs is mostly muscle, and it's used to be able to manipulate that huge head of theirs, not only for fighting other males during the breeding season, which, by the way, is going on right now. The bison breeding season is going on right now. But also they use their huge head in the wintertime to move snow away, kind of like a snowplow, in order to get down to the grass below the snowpack. So wolves do hunt bison, but it is a challenge. It's particularly tough. Bison are particularly good at circling the wagons, if you will. Oftentimes, if they're threatened by a predator, that is, bison are threatened by a predator, they'll oftentimes circle around with the young in the middle. It's pretty impressive to see. They're very good at defending their young. In fact, I'll tell you a little story. One time I saw a female bison with a calf that looked like it might have been just hours old. And I think the bison had gotten separated from the rest of the group because perhaps it had just given birth. The group had walked off, and now the female bison was catching up with her new calf. Well, a group of 3 wolves surrounded that female, and for 45 minutes those wolves kept going in and getting behind her, and she'd wheeled around and she'd run it off, and then another wolf would get in behind, and that calf did an incredible job of staying underneath her mom, avoiding being predated upon. So not only was the female working hard, the mom was working hard, but the calf was working tremendously hard to be under mom and not get stepped on. It was pretty impressive to see. After 45 minutes, the wolves gave up and moved on because they realized that they had a very formidable opponent. Looking at this scene, I don't know that I would necessarily be too fond of preying upon bison. Okay, so another potential. So the next few animals are sort of the other. So 90% of what the wolves eat are elk, about 5% bison, and then so the other 5% is sort of other animals, and moose is one of those. I don't know if there's an animal outside of moose that is so well adapted to this place. They're so built for long, cold winters and deep snow and short, cool, dry summers. For example, look at that dewlap. Do you see that little thing on the chin of the left moose there? That right there is called a dewlap. When that moose goes down in the water and drinks cold water or eats aquatic vegetation out of the water, when it picks up, the water goes down the chin, hits that dewlap, and drips off instead of going down its neck and chest and making it more cold. So that dewlap actually serves as like a bib. So it's an adaptation towards them living in this cold place. Bighorn sheep. Now in the summertime, you have to climb a mountain to see bighorn sheep. In the wintertime, the high snows in the mountains push bighorn sheep down to the lower elevations. And the place to look for bighorn sheep are cliffs. And bighorn sheep do a tremendous job of using cliffs, rocky cliffs that is, in order to avoid being predated upon by wolves and other predators. Pronghorn, sometimes called pronghorn antelope. They are the healthy adults aren't particularly susceptible to wolves, but certainly their fawns are. And this animal on the screen right here, the pronghorn antelope, can actually run 60 miles per hour. Pretty amazing. Okay, so there's probably not wolves in North America or beyond that have been more studied than these Yellowstone wolves. A lot of effort has been put towards learning as much as can be learned about these wolves. And you'd think by the year 1995, when the wolves were reintroduced, you'd think we'd know all there was to know. But so much has been learned. And it's great. As Natural Habitat Adventures guides, we're in close contact and have developed excellent relationships with the wolf researchers in Yellowstone and Grand Teton National Parks. And we're oftentimes able to share information, which really increases our opportunities for seeing wolves and seeing great behaviors. So wolves, like I said, oftentimes prey on elk and other animals, and depending on the year, some people ask, well, how much do they eat? Do they eat everything? Well, it depends on the year. They're much more likely to eat a lot more of what they kill in the fall, when the elk are much stronger and harder to take down. But in the late winter, when the elk are harder to take down, when the elk are easier to take down because the elk have been eating dry, low quality forage, all winter and walking in deep snow, the elk are easier to take down, in which case maybe the wolves don't eat quite as high a percentage of that food that's available. The great news is that there's a lot of scavengers out there and nothing goes to waste. In fact, you can see that raven on the left side of the screen there waiting for that wolf to move off to clean up the scraps. Ravens are incredibly smart, as maybe you know. They're about hawk-sized animals. They're quite large. And on average, studies have shown that a wolf kill, it's not unusual to have 20 or 30 ravens around a wolf kill waiting for an opportunity to scavenge. Another common scavenger that stays close but not too close to wolves is the coyote. The coyote, you can tell this is a coyote because they have much longer ears and a longer, pointier snout relative to the rest of the body. Plus, wolves on average weigh between 90 and 100 pounds, while the coyotes weigh between 30 and 35 pounds. This is a coyote with one of our vehicles behind it, and this is an example of how coyotes are different than wolves. Coyotes are much more tolerant of people than wolves are. Wolves are much more likely to keep their distance. And this is an example of, in this case, this is where a coyote was chased by a wolf, and the coyote ran right to the road and right to us in our vehicle. And that coyote knew that wolf was going to pull up sooner than the coyote would. So pretty interesting how quickly, and that was behavior that we saw the same summer that the wolves were reintroduced. So coyotes are very smart, and they learn that behavior very quickly. Just a note about our vehicles. We have these roof hatches, as you can see, in all of our vehicles that allow us to view some of these wildlife. Let's say an animal is close to the vehicle, and we don't want to get out so as not to put ourselves in danger, but also so as not to stress out the animals. This allows us to use the animal or to use the vehicle as a blind. There's a real opportunity to get some great looks at animals and take some great photographs as well. I should mention too, notice the road is plowed. The only road in Yellowstone National Park that's plowed in the wintertime is the northernmost road in northern Yellowstone. The rest of the roads are not plowed, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later. Another animal that potentially interacts with wolves is red foxes. And red foxes, it's interesting, red foxes are about 10 to 15 pounds, and although coyotes don't seem to get along very well with foxes, nor the other way around, sometimes wolves tolerate foxes at a carcass because, and well, this is just a hypothesis, but it's been observed, and I've seen this in the field, where foxes will actually do a pretty good job of running off ravens, so that ravens aren't eating too much of the carcass. So perhaps wolves tolerate foxes for that reason. Pretty interesting. Another common scavenger is the bird scavenger, the bald eagle. Bald eagles certainly do eat fish. They do catch fish, and they do catch ducks. But scavenging, especially in the wintertime, is a major source of food for them. And so oftentimes we think of the bald eagle, the United States symbol, as having the white head and tail. They don't actually get that white head and tail until they're 4 or 5 years old, and that signifies that they are reproductively mature. We also have the second type of eagle in North America, and that's the golden eagle. They too do a lot of scavenging and benefit from the wolves. Now this is an example. I mentioned just a minute ago that most of the roads in Yellowstone are not plowed. They're actually groomed for over-snow vehicles. So if you've done any skiing at a ski area, you know that the trails are groomed for skiing. These roads in Yellowstone, most of the roads in Yellowstone, are actually groomed for either snowmobiling or snow coaching. And we travel in Yellowstone with Natural Habitat Adventures in these pretty slick-looking mat track vehicles. So this is a Mercedes-Benz Sprinter that's been converted to four-wheel drive and lifted up on a larger chassis in order so that there's plenty of room in that wheel well to fit these mat tracks. And these vehicles travel over the groomed roads of Yellowstone. These vehicles also have roof hatches. So again, you're close to a group of bison, you don't want to get out so as not to put yourself in danger or to stress out the animal, because of course we never want to watch these animals at the risk of stressing them out. That would sort of defeat the purpose of what we're doing. But these roof hatches are really nice. So this slide is to remind you to mention that if you haven't figured out yet from the slides with all the snow in them, this can be a pretty cold place in the wintertime. You can see it's 0 degrees on the thermometer up there, or minus 15 degrees Celsius. It can be quite cold. However, do know that for our trips we do provide parkas and boots that are quite warm. We provide hand warmers, warm lodging, hot showers of course, warm vehicles, and then we've always got strong coffee brewing. We always brew some hot, strong coffee around here. So we've talked a lot about Yellowstone. In this itinerary, we also spend time in Grand Teton National Park. And these, of course, you probably recognize as the Tetons. The Tetons are some of the most rugged mountains in North America, and they're actually some of the youngest mountains. You know, the more jagged mountains are, the younger they are. And so these mountains are thought to be some of the youngest in North America. But interestingly, well, you can't tell because it's snow-covered, but it's kind of a grayish granite and metamorphic, metamorphic nice rock. The rock on top is actually some of the oldest rock in North America. So these mountains have been pushed up very recently geologically, but yet that rock is ancient bedrock pushed up deep from the earth. You know, so oftentimes you hear those expressions, Jackson and Jackson Hole, be used interchangeably. Jackson is the town located at the southernmost part of the valley, but Jackson Hole is the whole valley surrounded by mountains. This in the foreground is Mount Moran, which is named after Thomas Moran, who was a famous watercolor painter, who was really the first guy to paint this area with watercolor paintings. One of the really, so potentially I should say, any of the animals that we've seen already on the screen, we could potentially see in Grand Teton National Park as well. But one of the really notable things about the southern end of this itinerary that we lead in the wintertime is the National Elk Refuge. In the wintertime, there are between 7,000 and 8,000 elk that winter on the National Elk Refuge, which is literally just on the north end of the town of Jackson. And certainly one of the highlights of our trips that we lead is we do actually have these horse-drawn sleigh trips that we actually take in amongst the elk. And even though these are wild elk, these elk are incredibly wily, incredibly wild, but for several decades, they've just gotten used to these horse-drawn sleighs being pulled amongst them, and we get some incredible behavioral observations as well as some great photography opportunities. Some other animals, some of the birds, for example, we have trumpeter swans. Trumpeter swans are the largest waterfowl in North America. They're twice the size of a Canada goose. This is the American dipper, which is actually quite a bit smaller bird. This is actually smaller than a robin, sort of more sparrow size. And they all they need is a little patch of water that's unfrozen, and they dive down and catch aquatic insects, particularly not necessarily adults, but rather larvae and pupa forms of aquatic insects. And the reason they're called dippers is they constantly are dipping, they're bending their legs. And there's a couple of hypotheses for that. One is that it might be communication, it might be sign language to other, communicating with other American dippers. Also, because as you can see, that's a pretty cold scene with their skinny legs with no feathers on them. Maybe they're constantly dipping in order to stay warm, kind of like what we would do if we were standing in that position as well. We also have a member of the jay family called Clark's nutcracker who live heavily upon pine nuts. Moving back to mammals, we have weasels, both short-tailed weasels and long-tailed weasels, and they have the incredible adaptation of, in the fall, turning white, whereas in the winter, so in the winter they're white, in the summer they're a brownish color. Another member of the weasel family is the otter. And actually we have a more likely chance of seeing otter in the wintertime than summer. And the reason why is that, remember, these animals don't have gills, they have lungs. So they have to periodically come up to breathe from the water. And in the wintertime, there's not a lot of areas that they can come up to breathe. So they're more concentrated in those areas of lack of ice for them to come up and breathe and to come up and feed on fish. Because they can't necessarily, if they catch a fish under the ice, they can't necessarily eat it while they're underwater. We also have pine martens, which are a member of the weasel family, about the size of a small cat. Now we have an opportunity at times on our programs to explore by foot or by snowshoe, and of course you never know what we're going to see when we're out, tracking and out exploring. Every trip I lead is different, and I'd like to finish with this slide, and I'd like to actually finish with a story. And the story is about a fellow on a trip 6 years ago, and he was an 82-year-old man, and he was from Poland. And this was, I think this was about 7 years ago. And he had been on several wolf watching trips before. He'd been to Europe, Eastern Europe. He'd been to Scandinavia, Canada, Alaska to look for wolves. He'd seen tracks, and he'd heard howling, but he'd never seen a wolf before, and he kind of felt that 82 years of age, he just felt maybe this was his last chance to just travel across an ocean, just to see wolves. And on a chilly -10 Fahrenheit early morning in the Lamar Valley, we spotted a whole pack of wolves. And of all the group, and our group size is, our groups are very small. We never have more than 7 people in a vehicle. But in our group, he was the last person out watching. Everyone else was getting cold and went back into the vehicle. He was the last one out watching. And as he was looking through the spotting scope at these wolves, he had tears in his eyes, and I think they were actually freezing on his cheek. But this is an example of why I do what I do, and I never forget the experiences, the shared experiences of watching wolves. So I want to thank everyone for your attention. It's been great to spend this time with you, and I'd be glad to take any questions that you have. I think we do have plenty of time for questions.
We do. Thank you, Kevin. And we've got some good questions here, but just want to remind our audience members that if you have a question, you can send that in, and you can do that through the question box, which is over on the right-hand side of the screen. If you need a reminder, you might need to open up the control panel by clicking on the orange button with the white arrow. Okay, so then you'll see where to type the question. So we have a couple of questions here, and so I'll read this first question. It says, was the wolf reintroduction into Yellowstone controversial at that time?
Yes, the reintroduction was very controversial. Wolves had been eradicated by 1926 from Yellowstone, 1926, and the eradication was actually led by the U.S. government. The idea back then was that the more elk and bison and other prey animals we'd have, the more people would come and visit Yellowstone. So the U.S. government actually began sort of a war on predators, if you will. So wolves, mountain lions, and coyotes were actually hunted out of Yellowstone on purpose. Bears were okay back then. It was thought that people wanted to see bears, but the other predators, not so much the case. And so it's pretty exciting to think that 70 years later, that is from 1926 to 1995, it's pretty exciting to think of the difference in our approach towards ecosystem management and our approach towards intact ecosystem, having all the parts there. So pretty exciting to think, but at the same time, not everybody was as excited. So it was controversial. And one of the ways in which the government sort of appeased some of the opposition was that instead of the wolves being introduced under the full protection of the Endangered Species List or Endangered Species Act, they were endangered species, or they were introduced as endangered species, but they were listed as non-essential experimental wolves. And what that was is that was a fancy way of saying that the federal government could actually go in and kill wolves, not in Yellowstone, but outside of Yellowstone, could actually kill wolves with a little less red tape involved should a wolf get into trouble, get into livestock and potentially kill livestock. So that was a way to appease local folks, to make it such that if a wolf got a taste for livestock, that it could be more easily removed, or those genes, if you will, could be more readily selected against. But yeah, it definitely was controversial 20 years ago, and it's still very controversial now. We're of course at a different stage. Instead of being right, at the beginning of the reintroduction, we're now at the stage of the wolf scenario where they are here, and they're I think here to stay. And now we're sort of at that management stage, and I think where a lot of the controversy and discussion is how should wolves be managed.
That's great. Thank you. There was another question about what's being done today to preserve them, and it sounds like it's an ongoing conversation, isn't it?
Indeed it is.
Yeah.
In fact, if people follow that, I could spend the next half hour sort of answering that question in more detail. But basically, right now, the states of Montana and the states of Idaho actually have hunting seasons on wolves. It's very controlled. It's very monitored. Once the quota is met, the season's over. Wyoming's a little different right now. Wyoming has not been able to come up with a plan that is agreeable to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, such that instead of having a hunting season throughout the state, the state of Wyoming agreed to a hunting season on the outskirts of Yellowstone and Grand Teton, but opted to have the rest of the state be predator status. That is, wolves could be shot, poisoned, or trapped by anyone, anytime, other than just in the northwest corner of Wyoming. And a judge in the court of law, in the past year and a half, actually decided that was not acceptable, and so now wolves have been relisted on the endangered species list only in the state of Wyoming. So that's in litigation right now. Stay tuned as to what happens with that, but I imagine eventually they'll be delisted, and Wyoming will have a wolf hunt throughout the state, rather than to have a hunt in part of the state and not and have them have predator status throughout the rest of the state.
Okay. Well, we got this really great follow-up question from one of our listeners. She writes, can you describe some of the positive effects noted on the ecosystem through the reintroduction of the wolves to Yellowstone?
Okay. Well, it's interesting. I appreciate the question very much, and it's interesting that you use the word positive, because positive and negative, they're kind of subjective terms, but sort of depends who you're talking to as to whether or not they're positive or negative. But depending on how one feels about wolves, what one can never deny is that wolves have been an incredible ecological study on what happens when you remove a major top predator like wolves from an ecosystem, as our ancestors did prior to 1926, and then put them back in 70 years later. It's amazing what we've seen. And we've certainly made a lot of hypotheses and predictions, but it's incredible to see some of those predictions carry out. And some of those examples are, we have seen a decline in elk populations, which is thought that there's maybe a couple of different reasons for that, but wolves are partially the cause of the decrease in elk in northern Yellowstone. But probably the elk there now, 6,000 to 7,000 elk that are there now, is probably similar numbers to what were there when there were wolves prior to 1926. Another example of a change is that, or sort of an effect from wolves coming in, is within 2 years of the reintroduction of wolves in Yellowstone, in the Lamar Valley, which is that famous valley that some of the wolves were reintroduced into, within 2 years of the reintroduction, the coyote population was cut in half due to wolf predation. So is that a positive effect or negative effect? In that case, I think it's just an effect. Not very positive for the coyotes, of course, but but perhaps decreasing the coyote population down to maybe more pre-eradication numbers. And I'll use one more example, and there's a lot of examples, but one more example is that in before the reintroduction of wolves, there was one family of beavers documented as living in the Lamar Valley in the Lamar River. About 6 or 7 years after the reintroduction, there was 9 families of beavers living there. The reason for that, or the hypothesis, the prediction for why it occurred, the increase in beaver habitat and beavers living there, is because the elk that were elk would oftentimes hunker down in the river bottoms by the hundreds, groups of hundreds, and they'd browse down the willow shrubs and other shrubs and cottonwood trees. They browse them down very low. And if you know beavers, you know that beavers really like to eat the leaves and twigs of cottonwoods and willow shrubs along rivers. Not only do they eat them, but they use them for their dams and their lodges as well. Well, with wolves, it seems to have changed or contributed to a change in elk behavior. They no longer kind of hunker down in groups of hundreds down along the river. They're in smaller groups, spread out more. And what this has done is it's allowed the willows and cottonwoods to regenerate more readily, leaving food and building materials for beavers. And I've watched, over the course of the last 13 years that I've been exploring this ecosystem, I've literally watched these patches of willows grow from when they were, a foot tall to now being, over my 6-foot head.
That's amazing. And we actually had a question about whether beavers and badgers, if they competed with the wolves for food. So thank you for bringing that up. That's
yes,
amazing.
yeah. They're not really yet. So the beavers aren't really competing because, of course, beavers are vegetarians. But you might say, well, I think it's fairly well supported that beavers are benefited by the presence of the wolves. And as far as badgers are mostly eating small rodents. So not necessarily competing with the wolves so much. But potentially badgers could benefit from the wolves because badgers will sometimes scavenge off of carcasses that are left behind by wolves.
Okay. So there was another follow-up question about whether the wolf population is as heavy as they want it to be at this point, and then also if there's a natural predator of wolves other than man.
Okay. Why don't I take the second question first? So I appreciate that you said man because the largest source of mortality for wolves is people. But outside of people, the biggest source of mortality for wolves is wolf-on-wolf interactions. So wolves are very territorial, and wolves will kill other wolves that enter their territory. So that's actually, other than people, that's actually the largest source of mortality. And right now, it's thought that other than sort of prey availability and sort of territory size and things, perhaps one of the most limiting things right now on wolf numbers in Yellowstone might be other wolves and other packs, other territories. After wolf fighting and wolf-on-wolf deaths, the other source of mortality for wolves that's common is wolves getting killed while hunting. We learn at a young age that wolves take the young, the sick, the weak, right? But we oftentimes don't hear about why that is. Well, it's because every time a wolf hunts, they risk their lives. They risk getting kicked in the head. You saw that elk, that moose, that bison. They're incredibly powerful animals with incredibly powerful heads, incredibly powerful kicks. And every time a wolf hunts an elk, they risk getting kicked in the head, having major head trauma, or getting kicked in the ribs and having a rib break and puncture a lung. So hunting, or I should say, being killed while hunting, is definitely a major source of mortality for wolves. So remind me again, Lee, the second part of that question.
Sure. Yes, the second part was whether the wolf population is right about where everybody thinks it should be at this point.
Okay. Well, nobody really knows what it should be. And here's an example. This is pretty interesting. So when the wolves were reintroduced in those first 2 years, 1995 and 1996, the reintroduction went so well, and wolves did such a great job of making Yellowstone their home and reproducing very successfully, that the wolf biologists with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Yellowstone National Park decided that after 2 years, let's just leave them go. We've brought enough. We've brought as many wolves from Canada as we need. This is going well, and it's interesting because the plan was to actually trap wolves in Canada and bring them down to Yellowstone for between 3 and 5 years. But yet, according to biologists, 2 was satisfactory. How many government projects do you know that actually come under budget, right? But so right off the bat, the wolves were doing quite well. And then when I first moved here in 2002, the wolves in Yellowstone numbered 172 wolves. We didn't necessarily know it at the time, but it turns out that was basically the high level of wolves in Yellowstone. And it could be that might be the high level ever in Yellowstone. Now, for 2.2 million acres, 172 wolves might not sound like a lot. But now, right now, not counting this year's pups that were born in the spring, right now there's between 100 and 105 wolves in Yellowstone. So the numbers of wolves have actually declined since those high numbers in 2002. And probably a big part of why the wolves have declined is because there are fewer elk now than there were in 2002. And so, now that perhaps the numbers of elk are down to sort of more pre-eradication, pre-1926 numbers, perhaps the wolves that we're seeing now are down to sort of more normal, more pre-1926 numbers, and perhaps, we're hypothesizing, we don't know for sure, but we're hypothesizing, we're predicting that 172 was probably a sort of unnatural high number just because there was so much habitat, so many territories available, and then so many elk available for food as well.
Great. Okay, thank you. Okay, let's see. I want to go through some of the trip questions. We had a couple about the actual experience. Any recommendations for keeping camera batteries running during these cold conditions?
Okay. Yeah, outstanding. So that's one of those things that we always try to remind folks, not only at the welcome dinner orientation, but also throughout the trip, is keep, whenever you can, keep cameras, when you're not using them, keep them in your jacket, both in the vehicle and out of the vehicle. And then always have extra batteries. Always have extra batteries. Once we get into the parks, Grand Teton and Yellowstone, oftentimes we're less likely to be able to find batteries, particularly if you have unique batteries specific to your camera. But keeping them in the jacket when out of the vehicle, or even in the vehicle when not using them, is key. And then, of course, bringing extra batteries is important.
Okay, good. Thank you. There was another question about how difficult it is to get into Yellowstone and then see the wolves during the winter.
So the wolves in the wintertime are really most heavily concentrated in the northern range. There's a few groups of wolves that get into the interior, but where wolves can be in the wintertime completely depends on where their prey source is. In most cases, where the elk are. So wolves, just like elk, just like moose, just like bison, are more concentrated in the wintertime on their wintering grounds, whereas in the summertime, they're much more spread out. But like I said, the northernmost road that has the largest concentration of wolves up in the northern range of Yellowstone, that area is accessible by wheeled vehicle because it's plowed, whereas the rest of the park you have to have a snow coach to visit those areas. But as far as accessibility, anybody can drive through the North Gate in their own personal vehicles to look for wolves. But sort of my justification for my existence as a guide is that, again, I spent a lot of time up there studying these wolves and understanding better about their habits, where they tend to spend time. Plus, being in communication with the wolf researchers is really important too, and really helpful, because some of these wolves in these wolf packs have radio collars that help wolf researchers to follow them and track them and learn more about them. And we've been fortunate enough to develop relationships with these researchers, and we can share information. We share information with them, and of course they share information with us, and they can help give us more tools to increase our chances of seeing wolves. I should mention, and I don't think I've mentioned this, I should mention that we could potentially see wolves anywhere along our itinerary, anywhere over the course of the 6-day trip, through Yellowstone, Grand Teton, or the surrounding area. In fact, with those 7,000 or 8,000 elk on the National Elk Refuge, you can imagine there is a wolf pack there that frequents that area. So we could potentially see wolves anywhere along the way.
All right, great, thank you. All right, I think we have time for one last question before we stop with our Q&A. There was a question that just came in about how a new wolf pack forms. Does a young male entice the female to join?
Once again, opening a wonderful can of worms there. Thanks for that question. So, once again, you'd think by the year 1995 we'd know everything there was to know about wolves, but so much has been learned, and actually a lot has been learned on the subject that you're speaking of, basically breeding behavior, pack formation, that kind of thing. So during the breeding season, which oftentimes starts in late January and extends into most of February, we oftentimes thought of, prior to 1995, we would oftentimes think of the alpha male and the alpha female as being the breeders, right? And then the rest of the pack was subordinate and helped raise the pups. But one of the amazing things we've learned about these wolves since 1995 is that oftentimes subordinate wolves will breed as well. So non-alphas will breed in the pack as well. And what oftentimes happens is that when wolves are oftentimes 2-year-olds, once they get to be 2, they oftentimes will leave the pack and sometimes go off to try to find a mate to form their own pack. And so sometimes packs form with 2 wolves. They raise a litter of pups, and all of a sudden they've got 6 wolves, they've got 8 wolves. But another scenario that commonly happens is those subordinate wolves leave the pack, they breed, and then they return, the male to his pack, the female to her pack, and oftentimes, typically, the pack will actually raise the subordinate wolves' pups in another den close to the alpha's den, and that's pretty fascinating. In 2000, I can't remember if it was 2000 or 2001, the Druid Peak pack, which is a famous pack in the Lamar Valley. If you've seen National Geographic films about wolves, you've probably seen the Druid Peak pack. Their pack numbered up to 37 wolves in 2000 or 2001. 37 wolves. It was the largest documented wolf pack in North American history. 17 of those wolves were adults. 20 of them were pups that year, and it's thought that that was the litters of at least 3, maybe even 4 wolves in that pack. So, pretty interesting that way. Another quick example of a pack forming, or sort of a pack dynamics, is that last spring I was in Yellowstone with a group when the alpha. So there was this pack called the Lamar Canyon Pack, and the male alpha and the female alpha and their 6 pups from the previous year, they're almost 1 year old, they actually ventured into another pack's territory. The alpha male got killed by a neighboring pack. The alpha female and the 6 pups got away, and lo and behold, 3 members of the other pack that had killed the alpha male, 3 members a couple of days later showed up in the Lamar Valley. And everyone was holding their breath thinking, oh man, are they going to finish off the rest of the pack? Well, it turns out that the alpha female, apparently they came in peace because the alpha female accepted those 3 males, and now they're a pack with the female and those 3 other wolves from the other pack that had killed her alpha, along with some of her pups from the previous year, which are now considered to be yearlings. So that's an example of just a bizarre pack dynamic that I don't know if that's ever been documented before, and the only reason it can be documented is because some of these wolf packs have radio collars and are extensively studied.
Kevin, this has just been amazing. Just have enjoyed listening to every single thing you had to say today, and I think everybody else did as well. And we're going to wrap up the Q&A now. Just a reminder to everyone, we have recorded this, and we'll get it out to all of you by replay, by email. So, Kevin, let me turn it back over to you now for closing comments.
Thank you, Lee. And thank you, Lee, and thank you to all the participants today. I appreciate your attention. As a naturalist, I spend as much time as I possibly can in the mountains, in the woods, in the shrublands. But the second part of that being a naturalist, and I think the second responsibility of being a naturalist, is to try to teach as much as I can about this place, as much as I possibly can, about this place and about other wild places. So once again, thanks for the opportunity to do that today. I appreciate it.
And my thanks as well. We appreciate having all of you here with us today. And with that, we will say good day and conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody.